no, what's going on here? My world is turned around and I'm upside down like, oh, right, I don't know where my feet are up off the ground and I'm upside down.
"2,000 years later." 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. "12 seconds later." 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later.
No, what's going on here? My world is turned around and I'm upside down like, oh, right, I don't know where my feet are up off the ground and I'm upside down now.